But thank you for joining us. As Chris did mention, we did do a webinar earlier called Farm Succession Planning, the Kitchen Table Discussion. That was the first one. The whole goal of that one was to inspire you. We all know that there's not enough farmers that have their succession plan in place and need to start thinking about it. So based off listener feedback, today's presentation is going to be a little more technical, where we try and get to the heart of some specific questions. Keep in mind, we do keep these things general. The reason why is farm succession is a massive topic, and there's many different areas that need to be considered, but we want to get you as much information as possible. So as you can see here on your screen who we are, I'm Brent DeKoning. I live in southwestern Ontario and I love helping farm families. Full disclosure, I am not a farmer myself. I did want to be one and still would love to be one, but I had to realize I'm not handy. I'm what they call a numbers guy. So for the safety of myself, farm equipment, it's probably best if I stay away from it. Today I'm lucky to have with me Bobby Hinduja from our high net worth planning team. Bobby will tell you his greatest gift is that he thinks he's a stand-up comedian, but to be honest, his jokes aren't that funny. His actual greatest gift is to take very complex planning situations and make it so that we can all understand it. So we always appreciate having Bobby. As we all know over the years, the Income Tax Act has gotten quite complex. It's actually, this was 100 years this past year, the Income Tax Act in Canada, and it's starting to get more and more complex, so we need guys like Bobby to help us understand that. Like any good organization in 2018, we need a disclaimer. So the bottom line of this disclaimer is we're going to talk about some different strategies today from a high level, but before you implement any of these strategies, run them by your own professional team, your own accountants, your own lawyers. They know you much better than Bobby and I can get to know you from behind a webcam today. It's not uncommon where we meet with farm families, we're working through the planning, and we always say, take this strategy, run it by your existing team of professionals, and they might say, hey, that was a great strategy. However, Brent and Bobby didn't know this about you. You know, 5 years ago, you had done this transaction. So that's not uncommon, so we have to be aware of that. The other part is farm succession planning. A lot of people think that you can just go to one seminar and do step 1, 2, and 3, and you're going to be totally okay. Reality is your own farm succession needs to be customized to you. There has to be a customized process that you build. Your farm didn't get built overnight, so neither should your succession plan. This is a process that you need to work through. There's a lot of thought, there's a lot of dollar value here that you have to put into this. So from the last webinar I did share, when I meet with farm families, we always want to answer 2 very important questions. So the first one is, what is the future of this operation? This is such an important question to think about, regardless of whether you're looking at succession planning or you're still growing, outlining what do the next 5 years look like. I do a lot of work with a very good RBC account manager named Jim, and when Jim's meeting with his clients, he wants to know what are the next 5 years, and he'll go through the financials with them, and he'll actually talk about, okay, if you want to build another barn, this is what you got to get your financials looking like. Or if you want a better rate on your interest, this is what you have to do. These are the things that the banks are looking for. So it's always very important to know, where are we going? The rear view mirror is always a lot cleaner than the windshield, but we want to be looking ahead. And the second one is, what if something happens? So I've said it before and I'll say it again, every farm will be transitioned at some point in time, right? The reason is we don't live forever. So we've all heard about it where something has happened to a farmer and their estate plan was a mess, right? So in reality, your estate plan needs to be reviewed every 3 years because life changes. It's not something where you put an estate plan in place and tuck it in a drawer and walk away. It's not uncommon when I meet with farm families and we pull out the existing wills that there's a lot of outdated information. So keep that in mind when you're doing some planning. Every so often, pull out your wills and make sure the information is up to date or still relevant. I always say farm succession planning starts off kind of like a little hedgehog. It's prickly, no one wants to talk about it. So an option for everybody is to do nothing at all and just ignore it. But the longer you let it go, it starts to turn into this guy, and eventually it looks like a porcupine. And if you let it go long enough, you can end up looking like this guy, a dog full of quills. So we don't want that to happen here at RBC. We have lots of resources. That's the best part as being Canada, one of Canada's largest banks, is they reinvest back in to give us a lot of resources like Bobby. So there are resources out there to help you with your farm succession plan. You do have to reach out, though, and talk to your existing team and start talking about this sort of stuff. So on today's agenda, the first thing that we're going to talk about is why and how to hire an agricultural professional. The second is the capital gains exemption and how it applies to farmers. Third is children being given versus purchasing farming assets. And the last one is estate equalization for families with one or more non-farming children. So it's not uncommon that we have 3, 4 children. One wants to take over the family farm and the other ones work off the farm. What do we do? So if we dive right in, so why and how to hire an agricultural professional. So let's first start off with the why. So if you're a farmer, you're busy running your operation. You're emotionally invested, and a lot of this talking about succession, you don't even know where to start, or you're scared to offend your family. So you have all these different thoughts going through your mind. Oh, and on top of that, you're also weather dependent. You got to take off your crops on time. You're running a livestock operation. Those animals have to be alive. That means it's 7 days a week. You have a lot on your plate just keeping your existing business going. And in reality, you probably rather keep running your farm and working on the farm than you would even think about this stuff. So then what happens is you can go and talk to a professional. If you ever go and talk to a professional and it's about farm succession, and the very first thing that they don't do is listen to you and understand, run. Okay, because this is about you. If they're going to help you, they have to be able to understand you. The benefit of a professional is that, especially in business transition, there's lots of professional firms out there that this is always what they do. So I know our team ourselves, we probably meet 30 or 40 different farm families a year and help them with their transition. So we can take bits and pieces from around what's worked at different operations and put it into custom into their operation. They can help you explore all your different options, and it's tailored to your individual needs. So once you put that together, so you've seen your professional, you're way better off to get greater outcomes. So like I said before, a lot of farm values, I know where I am in southwestern Ontario, it's not uncommon that land trades for $20,000 plus an acre. So if you own 100 acres, you probably, and no debt, you're probably worth $2 million. So to pay a professional to help you transition that amount of wealth is well worth it. Because I've been called in on transition plans where people have tried to do them themselves and they went wrong, and that ends up costing a lot more than just paying for professional advice. The other thing it does is it takes it off you. So you're better at running your operation. You will make more money by focusing on what you do well and hiring people for areas that you don't want to, right? There's lots of examples I can go through in life where there are things that I could possibly do myself, but when I look at it, my most valuable resources are my time and my health. So while I have that, I want to make very important choices with that. When I look here at greater outcomes, if you're having a difficult time and explaining your choices on your succession plan to your family, it helps to have a team of professionals, because you're basically showing your family then that you've put a lot of thought into this. This isn't something you just came up with, right? If you can show that you've hired a team of professionals, you've thought this through, and they're backing you, that will also translate into your family discussions when you talk to them about your choices. So I'm going to hand it over now to Bobby Hinduja, who's going to walk through the lifetime capital gains exemption.
Right, thank you very much, Brent. So I have to say, I had a whole bunch of jokes planned, and then Brent immediately killed my credibility as a comedian. So I will stick to tax planning today now. What we want to talk about, a couple things today. We want to talk about the capital gains exemption. What is it? How does it apply to farmers? How do farmers qualify for it? And then when we understand all that, maybe a couple of real life examples that may be applicable to you in terms of how the capital gains exemption can be used. But before we get into any of that, we want to make sure we understand what a capital gain is. So from a Canadian tax perspective, imagine a situation where I bought a share of a publicly traded stock just on a stock exchange, and I bought it for $1. And it's now worth $1,001. So there's $1 million embedded gain in that stock. Okay, so I sell it, I realize that $1 million gain. The government basically says, well, Bobby, we're going to tax that, and we're going to tax it at about 27%, and that's an Ontario tax rate. But each province is pretty similar. So on that $1 million gain, I pay about $270,000 in tax, and that essentially is how a capital gain is taxed in Canada. Okay, now that applies if I'm selling a public company stock. That applies if I'm selling my private company shares. It applies if I'm selling, let's say, commercial property, but it also applies if I'm selling other types of property, like a certain type of assets, like farm assets, right? But the one thing the government says is, okay, we want to encourage certain types of businesses. So if you sell a qualified small business corporation, or qualified farm property, or qualified fishing property, then we'll give you a portion of that capital gain tax-free. Okay, so specifically for farmers, if you sell something that's considered qualified farm property, you get $1 million of that capital gain tax-free. So if we apply that tax rate of 27%, if I sell what's considered qualified farm property, then I get $270,000 in tax savings. So obviously something I want to benefit from. Now keep in mind that's available once during your lifetime. So imagine I sell one piece of farming equipment or farm land that's worth more than $1 million. I use my exemption there. If I sell another piece of farmland in the future, well, I've already used my exemption, so I get it just once. Okay, so that's one key takeaway. But again, I want to make sure I benefit from it because that's worth $270,000 in tax savings, approximately, in Ontario and across the country, pretty close to that amount, if I'm selling what's considered qualified farm property. Okay. Now I want to make one thing clear in terms of what we're not talking about today. So I'll go back to that RBC or that share example I talked about, where I bought a share on the stock exchange for $1. Okay. And it's now worth $1,001. So there's $1 million embedded gain. Now, in my initial example, I said if I sold it, there's $1 million gain and I pay tax on that. Okay. Well, what if I just give it to my son? So in my will, I say I have the stock and it goes to my son. Well, the government essentially taxes me on that as if I sold it. So my estate would owe the $270,000 in tax if I transfer it to anyone other than my spouse. So let's say if I transferred it to my son. So that applies again if we're talking about shares of a public company, shares of a private company, commercial property, same concept applies. If you leave it to anyone other than your spouse, the government taxes you as if you sold it, okay? The one exception, or there are a couple exceptions, but the one exception I want to talk about right now, and then we're not going to talk about it for the rest of the presentation, is if you have qualified farm property and you transfer that to your children, then the government will not tax you on that transfer as long as it meets the criteria of qualified farm property. So I'll give you an example. I have a piece of farmland that I bought for $1, let's say. It's now worth $1 million. So there's about $1 million embedded gain. But I don't sell it, I leave it to my son. The government says, well, if it's qualified farm property and it meets the criteria, then we will just let you transfer it to your son without any tax body. And then when your son sells it, if he sells it a few years later for, let's say, $1.5 million, he'll pay tax on the difference between the $1.5 million and the $1. Okay, so we'll just tax him when he sells it. So the one benefit for farmers from transferring their assets to their children is that they can transfer them without triggering that embedded tax. Okay, but that's the one time we're going to talk about it today. Otherwise, today we're going to focus on the capital gains exemption, which is that $1 million of tax-free capital gain that's available to farmers. And in Ontario, that's about $270,000 in tax savings. And we're going to talk about it in the context of a sale of a farm property. Okay, so one thing key takeaway you keep hearing me say is that if it qualifies as qualified farm property. So obviously there are certain criteria that we have to understand as to what actually constitutes qualified farm property. And we'll talk about that, but before we get there, from a very high level, what are types of farm assets that are considered qualified farm property? So we have shares in a family farm corporation, which we'll talk about a little later on, farmland, farm buildings, and quota. Okay, so if I sell farmland that I own personally, or I sell a farm building I own personally, then it could theoretically qualify as qualified farm property as long as it meets certain criteria. Same with quota. If I have shares of a company, and that company has farm assets in it, if it meets the criteria of a family farm corporation, then it will meet the criteria of qualified farm property. Meaning when I sell it, I will get the capital gains exemption. Okay? Now, certain assets, if I own them personally, I will not get the capital gains exemption, such as farm inventory, farm equipment, and farm machinery. Okay, so if I sell those, there's no capital gains exemption available. it'll never be considered qualified farm property. Just the items that you're seeing on the left, they will qualify as long as they meet the criteria of qualified farm property. So now we go, okay, Bobby, you've kind of prefaced it enough that as long as you meet the criteria of qualified farm property, when you sell the property, you get the capital gains exemption. That's great. What exactly is the criteria for qualified farm property? And that really depends on what type of asset we're looking at. Because if we're looking at real or removable property or eligible capital property, if we take a real or removable property, that's farmland or farm building. And if we say, okay, well, for farmers, what's eligible capital property? The only one is quota. Okay, so if I have farmland, farm buildings, or quota, then it will be considered qualified farm property if it's used in carrying on a farming business in Canada by an individual, spouse, parent, or child. Okay, so big picture, if I have farmland and I have been using it in a farming business in Canada, or my son has been using it, but it's in my name, if I sell it, then I should get the capital gains exemption. So sounds very straightforward, but there's a reason why the Tax Act is like over 1,000 pages now. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I think I'm being asked to stop for a minute, so I will, and then I will just wait to get the cue. Okay, so I think we can start now. Thank you very much. Okay, so just to take a step back, what I had said was that if we have real or removable property, which is farmland and farm buildings for farmers, and eligible capital property, which is quota for farmers, if it's used in carrying on a farming business by me, let's say if I'm the owner, or my son, if I'm the owner, then when I sell it, I should get the capital gains exemption. So it sounds very straightforward. And again, I kind of made the comment that, well, we have to make sure we understand what the term used means, because used is not a simple definition. And the tax guidelines actually provide some context in terms of what does used actually mean. Okay, so what used means actually depends on when you bought the farm property. And the rules changed on June 17, 1987. So if you bought your farm property after June 17, 1987, you have to meet about 3 criteria. Number 1, you have to own the property for at least 24 months prior to the sale. Okay. Number 2, for at least 2 years of ownership, gross revenue from farming must exceed the total of all other sources of income. And finally, the property was used principally in a farming business where the individual, spouse, parent, or child is actively engaged on a regular and continuous basis. So I said a lot of words there, and they're all the proper words in the tax guidelines, but big picture, what are they saying? To get the capital gains exemption for the sale of, let's say, farmland, it has to meet the definition of qualified farm property. And if you bought it after June 17, 1987, you have to have owned it for the last 24 months prior to sale. In any 2 years of ownership, not just necessarily the last 2 years, but in any 2 years of ownership, your gross income from farming was greater than the total of all other sources of income. And finally, the farm property itself was used principally in a farming business, I'm sorry, where either you, your spouse, your child, or parent was actively engaged on a regular and continuous basis. Okay, so that's the big picture. Now, what if you purchased that property prior to June 17, 1987? Well, the rules are a little bit easier, and what they say is you got to meet one of 2 things. Either in the year in which the farm property is being sold, it has to have been used principally in a farming business, or if you don't meet that one, in any last 5 years during ownership, in any 5 years of ownership, the property was used principally in a farming business. So what they really say is, if your property is owned prior to June 17, 1987, then you got to meet one of 2 tests. Either in that year, that property was used principally in a farming business, or if you weren't farming it that year, in any 5 years of ownership, doesn't have to be the last 5 years, in any 5 years of ownership, it was used principally in a farming business. So I will say, if you're going to rely on the pre-June 17, 1987 rules, to just have a chat with your accountant, because certain farmers may have been so I may have been a farmer who bought my farmland in 1985, and I still own it today. So I think I'm under the old rules, but my accountant may have done a certain filing in around 1994 that puts me under the new rules. So I would just say, I don't want to make this too technical, but I would just say that make sure you check with your accountant if you think you're going to benefit from the old rules, because they're a little bit easier to meet, just to see do they actually apply to you. Okay, so now before we go into further discussion, we should actually say, what, big picture, we see terms there: used principally, actively engaged, regular and continuous basis. Okay, What do those terms mean? Like, how do I know if I'm meeting that definition? So we're going to put a pin in that right now, but we recognize that we got to come back to that. Now, this is just for real or immovable property, farmland, farm buildings, or eligible capital property quotas. What if I have shares of a family farm corporation? So instead of owning the assets personally, I own them in a corporation, okay? So how do I meet the criteria of a family farm corporation? And really, I have to meet two. And basically what they say is, well, throughout any 24-month period prior to the sale of the shares, at least 50% of the property owned by the family farm corporation is used principally in a farming business where the individual, spouse, child, or parent is actively engaged on a regular and continuous basis. Okay, fair enough. And then they say, well, right at the time of disposition, all or substantially all, and for tax purposes, that's defined at 90%. So all or substantially all of the fair market value of the property owned by the family farm corporation is used principally in a farming business where the individual, spouse, child, or parent is actively engaged on a regular and continuous basis. So, okay, big picture, what does that mean? What they're really trying to prevent is, imagine Bobby has a corporation and I have some farm assets, but I have a lot of other non-farming assets. I run other businesses through there. What they don't want me doing is trying to benefit from the capital gains exemption available to farmers by selling the shares of a company that's really not mostly farming, right? So if I'm a hobby farmer and I have some farmland in my corp, but I run another business through there, or I have some other assets in there that are non-farming, and then I somehow sell that corporation, I can't say, well, I should get the capital gains exemption because I'm not going to meet the criteria of a family farm corporation. What this criteria does is it basically says, look, when you sell your shares of a corporation to meet the criteria of as a family farm corporation, we're going to look at two things. Right at the time of sale, are 90% of your assets used in a farming business where you, your spouse, your child, or parent are actively engaged on a regular continuous basis, and any 24-month period prior to the sale. So you have to meet this one for 24 months, where 50% of the assets similarly used principally in a farming business where you, your spouse, child, or parent is actively engaged on a regular continuous basis. So they're going to make sure these are active farmers essentially, okay? So we realize we have two tests to meet there. That's important. And we also recognize we see those terms again. Used principally, actively engaged, and also regular and continuous basis. So we have to understand what these terms mean. So let's go to used principally. What does that mean? So used principally means 50% of the property's use is in the business of farming by the individual, spouse, child, or parent. Okay, so a couple things to take away. What they're really saying is if you have a property, you got to use 50% of it for farming for it to be considered used principally. So I have 100 acres and I farm 40 of it, and then 60 of it I'm renting out to someone else. That's not going to be considered used principally because I don't meet the 50% requirement. Okay, so it'd have to be 51 acres, let's say I'm farming, okay, for it to meet the definition of used principally in that context. So a question I sometimes get is, well, look, Bobby, I have a 100-acre property, but about 65 are just, they're not workable. I can't use them for anything. Okay, so I can only use 35 acres. So then if I use 35 acres, will that property be considered to be used principally? Because it's only 35% of the total property. And there has been some guidance that suggests or that states that what they're looking at is to making sure that you're using that use principally only applies to the workable portion. Okay, so if I have 100 acres, but 65 just can't be used, then they're going to look at the 35 to say, well, the majority of the 35, are you using that for farming? And if so, then it should be considered use principally. Okay, so a couple of things to take away there. Also, what are some common questions I get? What if I used to use it for farming, but now I don't? What if I lease it to tenants who farm it? Is that considered farming? And kind of related to that, what if I'm in a sharecropping arrangement? Okay, so let's focus on the first one first. Seems fitting. So what if I used to use it for farming, but now I don't? So imagine a farmer who basically had a farm property, farmed it for many years, then kind of retired, but let his neighbor use it to farm, and the neighbor paid him rent. Would that be considered use principally? And there's been a court case and further literature that basically suggests in that situation, what they look at is, was the farm property used for farming for a majority of the period of ownership? So for example, imagine I owned a farm property for 20 years. I farmed it for the first 11 years, and then I retire. And then I let my neighbor farm it, and my neighbor pays me a rent. So would it be considered use principally? Well, I owned it for 20 years. I farmed it for 11 years, so that's 55% of the time of ownership that I farmed it. That's greater than 50%. Therefore, it would be considered use principally. Therefore, if I sell that property, then it would be considered use principally. Therefore, it would be considered qualified farm property. Sorry. Therefore, when I sell it, I would get the capital gains exemption. Okay, now if I change the facts a little bit, I bought that farm property. I own it for 20 years. I farmed it for the first 9 years. Then I rented out to my neighbor for 11 years. Well, now I've only farmed it for 45%. So now theoretically, it's not considered to be used principally. Therefore, that farmland will not be considered qualified farm property. Therefore, when I sell it, I will not get the capital gains exemption. So one takeaway we may apply that rationale to is if I'm a farmer and I've owned property for, let's say, 18 years, and I've farmed it for 10 years, and now I'm renting it out for 8 years, I'm getting pretty close to that 50%. And if I own it for like 3 more years, I'm now lower than that 50%. Meaning if I'm planning to sell it, it will not be considered use principally. So I need to have a chat with my accountant at least to say, look, does it make sense to maybe, if I'm going to sell this property anyways, does it make sense to sell it sooner rather than later to get my capital gains exemption? And the answer isn't black or white, right? Like it depends on a lot of things. I would never say sell the property just for the tax reason. Like the example I gave, the individual's already thinking about selling the property, right? But maybe if that individual can use their capital gains exemption somewhere else, then it doesn't matter, right? So I have another piece of property where I'm using it for farming, so I sell it, I get my capital gains exemption there. Therefore, I'm okay with this property. If I sell it, I don't get the exemption because I've already used it, right? But something to keep in mind that as you're getting closer to that 50%, you may want to just have a chat with your accountant. And then finally, what if I lease it to tenants who farm it? Is that considered farming / what if I'm in a sharecropping arrangement? So generally, the tax rules state that if you're renting farm property out or you're leasing it, we don't consider that farming income. We consider that rental income. So you're not in a farming business, you're in a renting business. Therefore, you're not using it principally for farming. You're actually using it for a rental property. So therefore, you will not meet the use principally criteria. Therefore, will not be qualified farm property. Therefore, when you sell it, you won't get the capital gains exemption. Okay. Now, sharecropping arrangements generally, they're not structured in a way. Sometimes they're not, I should say, to benefit from the use principally rule. So I will say this: what they really want to make sure for the use principally rule is that you're not just getting rental income, right? If you're in some sort of arrangement where someone else is doing the farming, you're either managing it, but you have risk of a farming business. Like if I'm renting my farm property out, then maybe I don't have the risk of the farm business because I'm just getting rental payments. But if I have some of the risk of the farming business, like if the crop goes bad, then I potentially lose the profits from it, then maybe I can make the argument it's farming. And what I'll say is that in those situations where it's not just a straight rental income that you're receiving, that have a chat with a lawyer and maybe look at, should we set up a proper joint venture and have a proper joint venture contract to basically make sure that if we ever get audited or if we're ever selling, we're considered to be use principally. And the lawyer can help you with the proper drafting of that. Okay? So key takeaway there, if you're having a joint venture in farming, you want to make sure it's seen as a joint venture in farming, not like it's just a rental property, and therefore you may need a proper agreement in place. Okay, so we talked about use principally. What does actively engaged mean? What does regular and continuous basis mean? Now, CRA does not provide definitions on these rules, okay? But what they do say is we will basically provide, some guidance as to what these things are or aren't. So what they've said about actively engaged is that actively engaged means you're actively engaged in the management or day-to-day activities of the farm, and you contribute time, labor, and attention, okay? Regular and continuous basis, what they say is, well, it's not an activity that is undertaken infrequently or at irregular intervals. That would not meet the requirement of regular and continuous basis. So big picture, what are they trying to say here? What they're really trying to say is, look, A, you're involved in the farm. Either you're day-to-day farming or you're involved in the management. You're contributing time, labor, and attention. You're not doing it infrequently, like you're not doing it once in a while. You're doing it on a regular basis. And your contribution actually matters. So if you weren't contributing that time or labor or attention, then the farm would actually suffer, right? So they want to make sure that what you're actually doing matters. But big picture, what they're really saying is, we do not want hobby farmers to get to meet the criteria of use principally, right? So we want to make sure there are people who are farmers who are actively engaged, who are in it day to day or in the management, right? We don't want the hobby farmers to somehow get this capital gains exemption that's available to farmers. And they've kind of commented in the past that, look, if your chief source of income isn't farming, we think it's going to be hard to meet the criteria of actively engaged and regular and continuous basis. So I think for active farmers, who are farming full-time, this will not be an issue. It's your hobby farmers where they may have a bit of a problem with this issue. Okay, so that's high level what actively engage on a regular continuous basis means. So one thing I want to talk about, we have a couple of situations here, but before we get there, I want to just go back to this idea of, we said earlier, what is qualified farm property and what isn't? And we said, look, farm machinery, farm inventory will never qualify as qualified farm property. Meaning if I own them personally and I sell them, I will not get the capital gains exemption. But then I said shares of a family farm corporation, as long as it meets the criteria, can it, you could potentially have it qualify as A, family farm corporation, B, qualified farm property. Therefore, when I sell the shares of my family farm corporation, I will get the capital gains exemption. So a question I sometimes get is, well, if I'm incorporating, does it make sense to put my farm inventory, farm machinery in the corporation? And then the value of that, or those pieces, will be embedded in the value of the company. Therefore, if I ever sell the company, I'll get the capital gains exemption. The answer is, yeah, that makes sense. If you're going to incorporate, put those farming assets that will not be considered qualified farm property, put them in the corporation, and then when you sell the corporation, the value of those items will be embedded in the share price of the family farm corporation. So theoretically then, you get the capital gains exemption on the value of those things. Not directly, but indirectly through the value of the corporation. Now I will say, that does not mean, or that is not a blanket endorsement of incorporating. Just because I'm saying, well, look, in a way, you can benefit from the capital gains exemption on the value of machinery and inventory if it's in the farm corporation. Therefore, incorporate, I'm not saying that, right? Because incorporation is not a black and white decision. There are a lot of factors that go into it. It's quite expensive to incorporate, and then year after year, the administration costs of, let's say, county fees, legal fees, they're quite expensive, more so than just owning it personally. So I will say that if you're thinking of incorporating, have a chat with your accountant to say, hey, listen, in my personal situation, does it make sense for me to incorporate? And if it does, then it probably makes sense to consider putting at least some of that machinery and inventory in the corporation. Okay, and then one final point is, if we are incorporating, does it make sense to not put certain assets in the corporation? Or more specifically, does it make sense to put everything in the farm corporation? And I'll say it probably doesn't make sense to put certain pieces of farmland in your corporation. Okay, so why am I saying that? I'll give you a quick example. Imagine a situation where I own 100 acres and they're farmed, but my house is also on those 100 acres. Okay, so if I own it personally and I sell it, I probably will get the capital gains exemption, but let's say it's worth about 1.6 million. So if I sell it, and let's pretend I just bought it for $1. Let's just pretend I bought it for virtually nothing. So there's a $1.6 million embedded gain on that property, right? So I sell it, I know I'll get the $1 million capital gains exemption, but I still, I guess I pay tax on 600 grand, right? That $600,000 gain, except there is something called the principal residence exemption, which basically says if you're selling your home and there's a gain on the sale of the home and you live in that home and there's certain criteria you've got to meet, but if you sell that home, the gain is essentially not taxed at all. With the theory being, you're selling a home, you're going to be buying a new home, so we're not going to tax you on the gain because presumably you're using that gain to buy a home, right? So right now, if you sell a home personally and it meets the criteria of principal residence, then you don't get taxed on that gain. So theoretically, I could have maybe an appraisal done to say, well, of the $1.6 million property, 600,000, let's pretend that the appraiser says, you know what, 600,000 is related to the value of the home, or let's say 800,000 is related to the value of the home, and 800,000 is related to the value of the farmland. So now when I sell it, the farmland I sold for 800,000, I use my capital gains exemption there, no tax. I sell my principal residence for 800,000, and I pay no tax on that because that's a principal residence. So that's a great thing, no tax on that sale. Except if it's in the corporation, then I get neither. Because if, let's say, Brent is buying I have my farm property in my corporation, and it's my home as well, and Brent wants that property, he's not transacting with me, he's transacting with my corporation. So Brent buys the property from my corporation sells it to him for 1.6 million. My corporation pays the tax on the sale of the farmland and the sale of the principal residence because the capital gains exemption is not available to corporations, it's only available to humans. So if I sell my shares, that's okay. But if my company sells the assets, that will not qualify for the capital gains exemption. And the principal residence exemption is only available to humans. So if my corporation sells the home that I'm living in, there's no capital gains exemption there. So the big picture there is before you put all your farmland in a corporation, if you're incorporating, have a chat with your accountant to see, does it make sense to keep certain assets out of the corporation or certain farmland out of the corporation? Okay, so I want to go through a couple of examples. So we'll go through a very simple one at first. We're asking the question, is the capital gains exemption available? So in 1988, Dad buys farmland for 100 grand. He farms it, and it's his only source of income until 2018 when he sells the farmland for $2 million. So that's a $1.9 million gain. And we want to know, is the capital gains exemption available? Okay, so did Dad, so we got to go through the criteria. Did Dad own it for 24 months? And we go, yeah, clearly he owned it for 24 months. He owned it for 30 years. So answer there is yes. Okay, criteria 2. Gross revenue from farming, did the gross revenue from farming exceed the total of all other sources of income for at least 2 years? Well, we know Dad's only source of income for 30 years was farming. So he easily meets that requirement. He had 30 years, but he only needs 2. So the answer there is yes. And was the property used principally in a farming business in Canada in which Dad was actively engaged on a regular and continuous basis? And the answer there is, from the information we've been provided, looks like it. You know, it's been used solely for farming. Dad was a regular farmer, therefore the answer is yes. We meet all 3 criteria. Therefore, Dad can use the capital gains exemption on the sale of the farmland. So a very simple example. So $1.9 million gain, we'll get $1 million of it tax-free and just pay the tax on $100,000. So let's complicate things a bit more, okay? And we'll say, well, what if we change the facts? Dad buys the farmland for 100 grand in 1988. Farming is the only source of income for him up until 2014. Dad passes away, and he gives the farmland to his son, and his son never farms it. And then in 2018, the son sells the farmland for $2 million. Okay, so the son has a gain, right? And our question is, well, will the son get to use the capital gains exemption? So we go through the 3 questions. Did the son own it for at least 24 months? The answer is yeah. He owned it from 2014 to 2018, so we meet that one. Was the gross revenue for the son, was the gross revenue from farming, or did it exceed the total of all other sources of income for at least 2 years? Well, we know that the son never farmed the farmland. So let's say he had an off-farm job. So the answer there is going to easily be no, because he had no farming income. And then finally, was the property used principally in a farming business in Canada in which the son was actively involved on a regular and continuous basis? Well, we know since Dad passed away, this farm was not used at all for farming, maybe just rented out. So the answer for that is going to be no. So we say yes, no, no. So we think the son will not be able to use the capital gains exemption when he sells the farmland because he doesn't meet this criteria, except actually the son can use the capital gains exemption on the sale of the farmland. So we may be asking, but how, right? How can the son use the capital gains exemption on the sale of this farmland if he didn't meet this criteria? And the answer really is that he is going to rely on Dad's years to meet the 2 tests he did not meet. More specifically, the gross revenue test. We're going to say, yep, son didn't farm it, but Dad had at least 2 years. Dad had about like 26 years where gross revenue from farming exceeded all other sources of income. So son's going to rely on Dad years. And son is also going to rely that out of the 30 years owned, 26 years of farming, 26 years were used in farming. So it was actively, there was an individual actively engaged on a regular and continuous basis. It was Dad. So son's essentially relying on Dad's years, and therefore son actually gets the capital gains exemption by relying on Dad's years. So big picture for us, what does that mean? So if I'm someone who owns farmland and I don't plan to sell it, and I'm a farmer, but I know I'm going to transfer it to my son, and my son probably won't farm it and probably will sell it at some point, I got to realize, well, wait a minute, he may be able to get the capital gains exemption by relying on my years. And what I need to do is work with my accountant to say, listen, Mr. or Mrs. Accountant, I'm going to transfer this property to my son. He'll probably never farm it. He probably will sell it at some point. But if he can benefit from the capital gains exemption, I would like for him to have the records available so that if he's ever audited or if he's ever working with his accountant, that he can show them that, look, I do get the capital gains exemption, even though I didn't farm. I'm just relying on my dad's years. Okay? So if you're leaving farm property to your kids and they're not going to farm, you just want to have that chat with your accountant as to what should I prepare today, or what can we prepare today, so that if the son ever does sell the property, they can benefit from the capital gains exemption, which really underscores the importance of planning, right? Whatever succession plan we want, the result will be achieved better if we plan for it. So I will now pass it over to Brent for the final part.
Thank you, Bobby, and everyone. If you want to send a small thank you, you can go online and find my email for putting the note in there to get Bobby not to do any stand-up comedy. So as you can tell, it's very important when you're looking at any type of planning to have proactive planning with your professionals. So often where a lot of people make a mistake is not reviewing their year-end financials with their accountants or their agricultural banker. Those financials tell you a lot of information, right? It's common in the farm world for people to go and drop off their year-end box at the accountant and then just go pick it up, right? So a lot of times accounting offices have a tough time doing proactive planning because their future plans aren't being shared with them, right? They need to know where you're going and then they can advise you. So on my last webinar, I shared a lot that your assets need to match what your lifestyle is. So often we can come up with reasons, or I've come across bad planning where things are very tax motivated or make as much money as possible. And yes, reducing taxes or deferring taxes is important, and yes, making money is what you want to achieve, but they can't steer the whole ship. We have to take a look at the big picture and say, what do you want to achieve, and then what are our best tools to start achieving that? So while Bobby was presenting, I was looking back, and I know when I talked about hiring an ag professional, I said why, but I never said the how. And the biggest part when I think about how to hire an agricultural professional is trust. You have to be able to trust them. There's a element of trust in lots of dealings, but with something this big, that's a majority of your net worth, you need a team of professionals around you that you can trust. In order to do that, I always recommend, if you're looking to hire a new professional, interview 3 of them. Ask them the tough questions. You know, the farm community is small. Talk to your neighbors that you trust and see who they used and if they had a good experience, right? There's lots of resources out there. You do have to put in some due diligence to find and vet them. But at the end of the day, if you find somebody, you trust them, they have the experience, you got to go by that. So big hot topic in the farm community is children being given farming assets versus purchasing it. So let's first start with giving farm assets to your children. You have to be careful with this. A person said to me a little while ago that you always want to transfer wisdom before wealth. And I thought that was such a good quote. So you got to make sure that before you give any farming assets to your children, that you've transferred the wisdom, that they can responsibly handle this. I've come across where children have been entitled and they've received assets too early, and it's portion of the family's wealth has been gone, right? You can also be protecting your kids by this. Sometimes they're just not ready. They might think they are, but they're not. They need a few more years under your guidance to be able to handle this responsibility. So before we make these types of decisions, there's a lot of questions we got to ask. This isn't something that we just decide, oh, hey, my son or daughter has reached 21 years old, they need to start getting ownership in the family farm. So some of those questions that you want to start asking yourself are, do you want to do it during your lifetime or at death, right? There is a difference. Is this through your estate plan that they get ownership? Another big question is, do they just get ownership in the farm or profit sharing? Those are 2 different things. Once you've given ownership, it's very tough to have it back. They now own it, right? So you want to be careful of that. You got to make sure, like I said, that they have the wisdom to handle that type of ownership. Profit sharing is a good chance for them to prove themselves on what they can do in your operation, and then the benefits there, right? Because you want them to be motivated. I'm not saying with this type of planning, don't give your kids anything. In the farm succession world, it's often common where mom and dad have to give up a good portion of their equity to the next generation to make it viable for them. But we really, really want to think this out very, very well. I do encourage mom and dad when I meet with them, think about what you want first. You're the ones that built this operation. So find out what you want, what you need, what your retirement plan is, and then figure out how you can bridge it to the kids. A lot of times I find when I meet with the farm family, a lot of planning was based off what the kids want, but it might be totally against what mom and dad want. Well, mom and dad, you spent the 40 years building this operation. You remember the blood, sweat, and tears it took to get it where it is. You're in charge. Yes, you want to help out the kids, but you got to also look after your own needs. So some of the other common questions I will ask are, do you have other non-farming assets, right? Is there other children? What about them? This is really, really important. With all your type of planning, I encourage you to think that if something happens to mom and dad and they're no longer here, will all the children still get together for Thanksgiving and Christmas? So family is very, very important, and you want to keep family harmony. And there are ways that you can do that, and you have to think about that. And that also gives you the benefit that before something happens to you in your life, you can have a family meeting and describe how you came to this decision on what you're going to do with your assets so they can hear it from you. Because after something's happened to you, it's now too late. And lastly, what is your retirement income? So if you are a farmer that's reinvested every single dollar back into the farm and you give it solely to your child or children, what is your retirement income? So your whole net worth or your retirement income is based on how well that child farms, right? So I'm not saying it's not possible, but you have to strongly, strongly consider it. You will have more flexibility if you have some assets outside of the farming operation. So I do encourage a lot of farmers that are quite a few years out from farm succession. If you have those really good cash years, maybe it looks like buying assets outside of the farming industry to help with your estate plan down the road. It will give you more flexibility, and you have to consider that of your overall plan. So next is taking a look at children purchasing farming assets. So everyone knows farming asset values have gone up a lot over the last few years, and it doesn't generate the cash flow to justify the asset value, right? So meaning if I owned $2 million worth of farming assets, I want to hand it down to my child, I probably can't charge him full market value for it. So one common strategy that a lot of people are looking at is saying, well, what if I give a discount? What if my child pays me 20 or 30 cents on the dollar? So saying they put in their time, I've transferred the wisdom to them, I trust them with it. Yes, they can't pay full price, but can they pay something? So some of those strategies that you want to consider is first, do they have the funds to purchase it, right? You know, does your child have outside money that they can do that? If they don't, can they take on the debt to do so, right? This is a great strategy where you can get your team of professionals around you and find out what your retirement plan is for mom and dad. Start there. What do mom and dad want their lifestyle to look like? What type of income do they have? How much money would they need to achieve their retirement plan? Then son goes, meets with his agricultural banker, and if it's a good one, like Jim, will work really closely with the son and help him understand the numbers and say, hey, if we put $1 million worth of debt on this farm operation, you can actively still grow, you can still take an income out, but it also encourages the son to start, or daughter, to start looking at the numbers and the financials. A lot of times when through farm transition, the children are great operators and great working in the operation, but they're missing the financial side, which is a very, very big part of the operation. Another consideration is, should they sell some farming assets to fund your retirement, right? You might have grown your farm operation to here, quite large. Does your son or daughter, if they're taking it over from you, do they need to start off that big, right? So say you're a dairy operation, you've grown your dairy to 200 kg. Does your son need to, or daughter need to take over at 200 kg? Or could they maybe start at 150 or 110, right? Do they need to start at the full size? And lastly is, can they put the sweat equity in, right? So that's not an uncommon strategy where child farms with parents for quite a while. They put in some sweat equity, and then yes, down the road, they will start getting ownership, but they put their time in first. It hasn't just been handed to them. This day and age where there are a lot of things that are instantaneous and technologies to thank for that, but some things that are really good do take time, they take hard work, and you've got to be willing to put that in, because if something's been given too quick, it can also be taken away that quick or lost. And bottom point there, I just said, yeah, you want to make sure that the farming operation remains viable without jeopardizing the current owner's retirement. So like I said, that's a balancing act where you work with your team of professionals, find out what do mom and dad need, what can the children afford, and work all those numbers out. And by the way, taking some equity out of the farm will also allow to be a possible pot aside in your estate planning for non-farming children. So that's not a bad strategy to look at. Which leads us well into equalizing your estate for farm families. So everyone has heard this before, fair is not always equal, right? So each one of your kids, so if I look at my own children, they're already quite young, but I can tell they are totally different. They have some characteristics that they get from me and my wife, but they each have their own needs. They're their own individuals, right? So I encourage you, take a look at that. Take a look at your current kids and what their needs are based on who they are. So it doesn't always have to be a fair, equal dollar number, right? So you want to consider that. But when you have non-farming children, and oftentimes when we do a mock plan on the client's estate, we'll uncover that it is quite lopsided, right? Most of the value usually is in the farm, and there's very few non-farming assets, right? The other things to consider is through your estate plan is not all assets are taxed the same at death, right? So when we do a mock run, you want to do a mock run on your estate as if you died yesterday and draw it out and say what assets go to each child and what are the after-tax dollars of their wealth. And if it becomes very unlopsided and you don't think that your children would be happy with that and they would not be able to get together for Thanksgiving and Christmas, you want to consider that, right? So some of these things to consider is establish a sinking fund, right? I tell majority of business owners and farmers, by reinvesting in the farm or the business, you tend to have a greater return on your money. A business owner, a lot of times when they reinvest back in their business, they want to make 10 to 15% on that money. But we're establishing a sinking fund not to make the most amount of money is because we want greater flexibility down the road. So if you can pull some of your money out of your farm, you had a good year and it's going to make 5, 6, 7%, but it's going to help meet your lifestyle and keep family harmony, that's important. Because remember, we want to keep all our planning based off what you need your assets to do, not always what makes the most money possible. Another option is sell some farming assets for non-farming children. That's always a possibility to consider. Through estate planning, a lot of times we will try and avoid joint ownership on farming assets because it can lead to problems down the road. Last one that's very, very popular is life insurance. I don't want to turn you guys into tax experts, but life insurance has is a great estate planning tool, and that's because it has some embedded tax rules inside the policies that make it very, very efficient to transfer money to the next generation. And it can be a great tool to be used as part of your estate plan, but you need to explore all the options. It doesn't mean you just go out and guaranteed buy a life insurance policy. Life insurance has a lot of different factors that you want to explore based on your age, your health, how you set up the policy, why you're doing it, how much money you put in for the payout, and that's where you want your team of professionals to explore that with you so you can make a well-educated decision. When you're working with your professionals, it's always being educated. If you work with good professionals as you're dealing with them, they'll educate you along the way, and you'll learn more. So with that being said, I just want to pop into one thing real quick because we're going to head into questions. Here, you'll notice our team, we do a semi-annual publication called The Intelligent Farmer, where we get a group of professionals together and we mail out copies to farm families. And the whole idea about this is just getting you guys more and more information. So income tax laws change, legal laws change. As those updates happen, we want you guys to hear about it. We want you guys just to be able to open it up. It's about 4 or 5 pages usually. Have a quick read and see what's changed to keep you guys up to date. So if you want to be added to this list, call Farah on our team at 519-747-1634. She'll be glad to add you to the list.